All right, welcome to F103 Alpha Total Army Analysis. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Chris Hughes.
And I'm Mr. Jim Kennedy. Woo!
And we are just happier than a pig in slop to be here with y'all and represent the Fort Belvoir Command General Staff College Team 29 as we continue our journey through force management. All right, next slide, please.
Fun management.
Fun management, absolutely. All right, so this is our ELOs for this class. We're going to look at the phase 3 and through 5 of the force development process, which we started back in F102. Look at some functions and role players of each of the phases of the TAA. It's a two-phase process. We're going to look at the role of TAA within the PPBE process, which we'll talk about in the next class, F103 Bravo. And then we'll look at documenting the organizational changes and utilizing FMS Web, which is a great tool which can benefit everybody no matter what their career field is. So,
yeah, we'll introduce FMS Web here, but in the actual class we'll do a PE that we'll give for homework. So we won't actually be utilizing FMS Web in this video.
True, but we'll just introduce it.
Check.
All right. So this is the force management model, which we recognize now, going through it the third time here. What we're going to focus on today is determine authorizations. So this is the class where we're going to say, okay, we've got the tow. Well, how much of that table organization equipment can we actually have? So we're going to look at the authorization piece of what it is the Army says that we need to accomplish the missions that we determined we had capability gaps in through looking through the strategy in F101. So
just to clarify, the TAA is determining the authorizations of how many of the tows how many of the units that we're going to have
for the total Army structure. Right.
So it doesn't matter if we have JLTV, Humvee, or Pack Mule. It's how many of that unit that can move X amount of material or has X amount of the capabilities. So it's that's what a lot of students get hung up on. They think authorization is people and equipment. In TA, we're talking authorizations of unit structure.
Yes.
Okay.
All right. So that's where we are.
Target.
All right. So our old friend, the force development process chart. We focused on 1, 2, and 3 last time, so today we're going to focus on a little bit of 3, but mainly 4 and 5, and specifically the total Army analysis process there in phase 4. The output of the total Army analysis process is there at the bottom, the R struct, the Army structure, and that lets us know, hey, this is what the Army is going to look like. So we will waste no more time with this slide and move straight into TAA. So what is TAA? It's a two-phase analytical process, and it answers the question, what is the best and most versatile mix of forces to build with our constrained end strength and our defined strategy? So how many of these type of units do we need, and which of the 3 combos either are the components, the Compo 1, Compo 2, Compo 3, which is regular Army, National Guard, and Reserves, but Jim will talk more about that here in a second. It produces the Army Structure Memorandum. So the R struct, it says by unit level detail the specific organizations and authorizations for the people throughout the program years. The POM, the Program Objective Memorandum, which we'll talk more about in 103 Bravo. But it also dictates, what units are going to be activated, which ones are going to be restationed, which ones are going to be converted, which ones are going to be inactivated. It talks about all those things in the Army Structure Memorandum, and we will do a PE that gets more into the Army Structure Memorandum in this class. Again, we talked about the Program Objective Memorandum, the POM Force Memo. So this is the this is the memo that we send up to Department of Defense and say, hey, look, this is the force we need funding for. So this is what our force looks like. That's what the POM Force Memo is. It says this is what we, after going through TAA, have determined we need to be able to accomplish the missions you set for us. Now we need the money to do it. So
it's basically the back brief to the commander, if you will, in the orders process. Okay, we've done our analysis. Here's our course of action. Here's what we're doing, boss.
So please give us resources to do that. We talked about in F101 the 5 parts of the Army plan. One of those was the APGM, the Army Program Guidance Memorandum, and that kind of gives guidance on how we're going to write the POM. So that's an influencing factor into this, and the Army Program Objective Memorandum is built using that plus the outputs of TAA being the R struct. G357 is the lead agency for the United States Army Force Management Support Activity, which documents the output of the TAA through MTOs. And we'll talk more about the FMS Web here in a minute. But the USAFMSA is actually the organization that documents all these outputs for us and builds those TOs, MTOs, JTAs, JTDs, and it is a FOA under the Director of Force Management. So it is a field operating agency, which we talked about in F101 under Title 10 and how we execute our Title 10 responsibilities. So this is one of those field operating agencies that help us do that. AR71-11, which directs TAA, is the Army regulation for TAA. It is in rewrite, but we do expect to see it early
January, February,
early next year. So that should come out while you guys are in class. All right. So I like to use pictures because, again, Jim and I are both from South Carolina. I'm from the better half. He's from the worser half. But we like to use pictures in South Carolina. So that's what we got here. So if you start in the upper left-hand corner, you see that you got all that strategy that we talked about in F101, and that informs the TAA process. And then the TAA also impacts the brigade combat teams because it says which ones are going to be activated, inactivated, or changed over, or restationed. So TAA is impacting the brigade combat teams. It is continuity. Do you have a comment?
Yeah, it also impacts industry because it tells us how many of certain things we're going to buy. So that impacts jobs and the economy. Congress's role is to protect the economy of the United States. Make no bones about it. So it impacts a whole lot of things. If we move a unit from one base to another, how much housing you're going to need, how much school you're going to need, how much health care.
And so again, what does that do to the economy of that area?
Yeah.
I mean, when you move a brigade combat team, you're talking about 4,000, 5,000 people and their families. So that has huge impact. So
either build or remove.
Yep.
It's huge.
So it does impact a lot the brigade combat teams and the communities themselves. It is a continuity of the future development plan and the planning, programming, and budgeting execution, which we're going to talk more about in 103 Bravo. It justifies to Congress what we asked for. So as we just mentioned, the results of the TAA, the RSTRUC, are going to influence the program objective memorandum, which is what we're asking them for money for. So they're going to say, well, why do you need this much money for this many units? TAA gives us the data to justify to Congress, hey, this is why we need this much. It gives us the data, which we'll talk more about when we get into the specifics of TAA phases.
Let me bring up something else with that, with justifying to Congress, having been there and done that. The Army is the only one that uses an analytical process like this. The Marines are too small. They have very specific capabilities. The Navy and the Air Force are built around ships and airplanes. The Army is so diverse and so complex with our structure. We're the only ones that use this TA-type process. And Congress, the congressional staffers and members have seen it. They understand it. They believe in the process, that it is a rigorous analytical process for us to give them an answer. So it's not just a bunch of people saying, I want this, I'm trying to protect my rice bowl. It is a process that Congress does understand.
Yes. And it produces, again, the output of TAA is the POM Force memo to the Office of Secretary of Defense and the RSTRUC memo to the Army. So again, when the RSTRUC comes out, we will make that into an executive summary, POM Force memo, send that to the Office of Secretary of Defense and say, hey, SecDef, you asked the Army to do this with the directed force. After going through TAA, this is what we come up with. This is the force we need to accomplish the missions that you've given us. And then it also goes into the POM, which goes back to Congress. It says, please give us money through the President's budget, which we'll talk more about in 103 Bravo. But that POM Force memo and the RSTRUC is aligned to that strategy. So again, that is the end result to be able to accomplish the strategy that they've asked us to, the missions they've asked us to do.
And this goes back to the Title 10 function, one of them being organize the Army. This is how we organize the Army to provide those requirements. That's why we do this, because the services by law are required to do it.
Yep. So now we'll talk about TAA's two phases. Go ahead, Jim.
Okay, so it sounds like a very complicated process. It takes about 10 months to do it. It's done every year. Some are big, some are small, but it's done every year. It's only two phases, though. The first phase is the science of this thing. It takes in a lot of guidance that you see here, all these different documents you talked about, certain scenarios and vignettes that we're given, that we're planning for. So it's a bit biased because we have to select certain work plans and scenarios, what we think is going to happen. We don't know, but without some plan, you can't. Any plan will get you there if you have no plan. So that's what we kind of look at. And they run hundreds of scenarios. Execution orders, Ebola a couple years ago. That wasn't thought of prior to this. So the president said we're going to do it. So those types of execution orders will come into play. And then what supply do we have in the designs or the tows that we currently have? And supply is the number that we have. But the big document is the directed force. That comes from the SecDef, the Joint Staff, saying here's what you need to have. Generally have the QDR and things like that. But this is the types of units you're going to have, big picture and an end strength. That's kind of like the commander's guidance if you think about it in an MDMP process. Well, then the Center for Army Analysis right here at Fort Belvoir does all the science. They put on their green eye shades, get the calculators out, run a whole bunch of scenarios. It's very complex. We'll run through a little bit of that in the class just to give you a sense of it. But it's not just a bunch of people sitting at a dartboard saying, hey, we like what we're doing. Let's protect our rice bowl. But the Center for Army Analysis does all that, and they are a field operating agency of the Army GA. We talked about that back in F101. So then that pumps out a big, huge Excel spreadsheet of the numbers of each type of MTOW that we need, or each type of TOW, that we need. Well, that goes to the Senior Leaders Department of the Army to say, yep, that's a good starting factor. And then it goes to the quality analysis. This is the human in the loop. This is where they sit down. People from the schoolhouses, majors, lieutenant colonels, civilians, the combatant commands, generally majors, lieutenant colonels, and colonels, all sitting down from everybody, all the proponents, looking at all the compos, saying, okay, is this really what we want to do? Because the organization said we need 2 MP battalions for Korea. Should that really be 3? And then so all that mix and matching goes on, that human in the loop. And then it comes out to a final brief that the secretary and the chief get, and they approve it, and then the R-Struck is built. All this happens in 10 months. It's a very long process. It's very busy. About the only time they get, they'll go through and they'll brief the chief over on the E-ring on Corridor 6 in the Pentagon, and the secretary on the 3rd floor. They'll brief them. They'll come back to the G3. They'll stop off at Lorraine's little coffee shop, get a cup of coffee, go back in their office across the hallway in the Army G3 and start working on the next TA for the next year. That's the only break they really get in between the two. It's a very fast, very efficient, but we're trying to get across to you, have confidence that there is a system. Is it perfect? No, but it is our system, and there can always be certain tweaks in it.
I also want to bring up, during that phase 2, that's where we're accepting some risk.
Yep.
So that's where the commander and the chief of staff and everybody, they're actually saying, okay, what risk am I willing to take to be able to get the organization that we believe we need?
And that's what this dotted line, thank you, Chris, that's what this dotted block is. What can I not afford because I have to have other things? And then that goes back as an input to the next TAA. Say, hey, here's stuff we really want to have but couldn't afford last year, so what about this year? Can we get it now? Or do we even need it because of all the different changes? So
it's exciting stuff.
It's great stuff. And as Chris mentioned, as part of doing this, they decide what compo they're going to be in. And there are 4 major ones that we use: active, guard, and reserve. You've heard them called compo 1, 2, and 3, active, guard, and reserve. We also have Army pre-post stocks as compo 6 because you have to have a place to put the equipment, and they're on MTOWs as well.
There's actually 9 compos, but these are the 4 compos that we believe that you'll probably work with in your future career. So not to overload you with too much information, to give you what you actually need, whereas highlighting these 4 compos.
Yep. And this is for the Army of 20. This is out of the latest R-Struck. It gives you a snapshot of what it would look like. Obviously, there's a lot of verbiage. We'll go through that in class. But this is what the Army's going to, how many BCTs? It's going to be 30 active, 26 guard, and none in the reserve. And here's how they're broken out between armor, infantry, and striker, support brigades, functional ones, aviation's in there. And then here's Army pre-post stocks down at the end.
All the way up to the 3 major Army commands, AMC, Force Command, TRADOC, to the ASCCs, into the COCOMs. This is a 1-slide picture of the United States Army for fiscal year 2020 through 2022.
Yeah, brigade level and above, they're your DRUs that are out there in the structure. And then the R-Struck memorandum, just to wrap this up, it is the end of the TA process. It is the product that goes out to the field to say, hey, Fort Sill, here's what's going to happen to your installation. We're moving this unit. We're keeping this unit. We're deactivating or losing this number of people. It outlines what the generating and the operating force are going to look like by SRC, standards requirements codes, down to, we don't just have engineer units. We have like 20 different types of engineer units, and that's what it gets down to, is each different type. So in 2 to 5 years, here's what you're going to look like and where you're going to be. Each organization, if you're out there in a unit and you have a question about what's going on with your branch organization, the R-Struck identifies who the organizational integrator is, who is generally, for most of the branches, a former battalion commander or a senior lieutenant colonel who is up there managing the organizational integration, helping, doing their briefs, talking with use of films about what changes to be made, coming up with ideas of how to change the Army, and they're working in DAG 357 Force Management. But this provides an input to the programming phase. Now that we know what types of units are going to be where in the structure, we can figure out how much that's going to cost for material, operations, training, personnel costs. So it's an input to the programming phase of PPBE. And it gives us, then once we have all that, then we go through and change the toes and modify them to MTOs once you know how much money we're going to get. And it is directive in nature. It will tell you Unit X is moving from Fort Sill to Fort Riley, or Unit Y is deactivating in Germany. It will tell you that specific level of detail. One unit may have personnel changes, certain MOS is being reduced. And this is the timeline. Just an example. This is one for which team? For 1923. So the one we're currently in. So we're here in January. So it started back in September. Started back in October. We're here in January. So we had the kickoff offsite, emerging growth GOSC, and they'll go through everything. So phase, this is phase 1 here. Capabilities demand analysis and CAA modeling. So we're in phase 2 now of resourcing here in January for the TAA. That structure will come out and be done. Then they'll start the next CA modeling again in July for the next one, and they'll produce the R-Struct for 2024 in the September 17 timeframe.
And there's a lot of acronyms on the slide, but just so you guys understand GOSC and COC. So GOSC is General Officer Steering Committee, and then the resourcing COC is Council of Colonels.
Yeah.
So those are just different types of meetings, different levels that they have to make sure the TA is on track.
Yeah, so a Council of Colonels will meet before the GOSC, so they'll work through all the work to make recommendations to that. And then it goes 2-star GOSC, 3-star GOSC, and then up to the chief. Okay, so everything here is for the operating force, generating force, works on a separate process. But again, have confidence that there is a process. Can it be improved? Yes. Is it perfect? No. But we have a process that has been refined and worked over the years.
And it's going to be your guys that make the process more betterish.
Or more gooderist.
Or gooderist.
Whatever.
Again, South Carolina terms.
We just grade English. We don't speak it.
Absolutely not. All right, so force management system. Talked a little bit about it. We're actually going to get into this, as Jim said, with a practical exercise, or not really practical exercise, but a homework sheet for answering several questions. You guys can work on in a group. We'll talk more about that in class. But everybody needs to get a force management FMS account, FMS web account. So the force management system, made up of all of these different systems you see down there, TOPMIS, Keystone, EDAS, SAMUS, all these type of documents, systems flow into the force management system. So it is a window into the force management world to be able to see how things are being developed and grown.
Now, one point, we don't give you the acronyms for all of these for a specific reason. You don't need to know. Unless you're a force manager or a personnelist type person, you don't need to know what these systems are. You just need to understand there's a bunch of them out there. Your window is FMS Web.
Yep.
Fair enough?
And FMS Web is going to show you the TOEs and MTOEs for the units that are out there and give you kind of the overall Army structure for the units that you're going to go to and things that you can do. So we've had students come through here who have been dentists, and they got back to their unit and they were like, hey, you're now in charge of finding out, or we have a recommendation for the structure of the dental corps in the West region of TRICARE. So they had to go to FMS Web to find out where all those dental offices were and what they were each authorized. So you leave here, you have no idea where you're going to use FMS, but chances are at some point in your career, you're going to be needing that type of information, and the easiest way to find it is through the FMS Web.
I actually had one student in class say that the day after the TA class, he got an email from his organization at West Point asking for their input for the next TAA of what their organization should look like to send it up for TA for this coming year. So this will be part of your life.
All right, so for the summary of the TA class, we looked at the TAA, which determines the best mix of organizations for a balanced, affordable force that results in the POM force, which we go and ask money for Congress to fund. It is a 10-month process. It's evolving and improving, but it is every year 10-month process. The Army Plan is the principal guidance for TAA. The directed force from the Joint Staff is a key input. Total Army involvement, so everybody's involved in this process. The resources, the MTOs and TDAs for the Army, all components, active, National Guard, and Reserve, command, schoolhouses, all of them. It is the principal product is the R-Struct, which is the message out there. So this is what the Army is going to look like, and we need to now program for that Army structure so we can pay for it. The two phases, phase 1, capability demand analysis, and phase 2, resourcing and approval, culminates in senior leader of the Department of the Army decision for force structure authorizations for the next POM. It announces TAA decisions and provides SRC level detail. So again, not only just engineer units, but each type of engineer units, not only sustainment units, each type of sustainment units, and so on. And the lead for this is the G357 Director of Force Management. But the FOA, the Field Operating Agency, is USAFMSA, United States Army Force Management Support Activity.
Right here, Belvoir.
Right here at Fort Belvoir, right down the road. Throw a rock and hit them. So that covers 103 Alpha, Total Army Analysis. The next class is 103 Bravo, PPBE.
Woo! It's all about that money. See you then.